Hello and welcome to another episode on the devlog of Runes of Aereal, where we're working towards Alpha 1. And today I'm going to be doing some explanations on how the turn process works. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let's run the sandbox here with some random tests. And with the turn process cycle, I mean, we start the battle. How does this work? How does the battle start? I get dealt some cards. I can do whatever. We can do bargain. Apply some venom. And then we end the turn.
Enemy turn.
The enemy turn happens.
Your turn.
And then it's my turn again. So how does it work internally? This process of going from starting the battle, ending your turn, and getting to your turn once again. So how does it work? So the battle here is in this battle layout. And the battle layout, when we go to the event sheet, there is, on start of layout, some stuff happens, which is nothing to do really with the turn sequence, but the magic happens here. It starts with prepare battle, so there's a lot of loading going on and some initializing stuff, which is not really part of the turn process. It's part of other videos, which I'm going to explain how this all works. But we start here with prepare battle, and in prepare battle, what we do is we reset the turn to 0. So turn is the variable which keeps track of how many turns are already played. How many cards already played is kept in the cards played variable. The lightning cards at turn start is for a special kind of cards that deal lightning cards at the turn start. Number of scrolls left per combat is set, or it's reset to the maximum scrolls per combat. So this is something that can vary depending on the skill level of your character. And then we queue a command called spawn enemies. And when this command is queued, essentially, the command queue process will take the command up and will execute the fitting function here in the command of functions. So it should be spawn enemies here, and then we call another function called spawn enemies, which is here in the enemies event sheet. And basically all that does is it checks, okay, if we're not in sandbox mode, then we need to take the combat definitions of the configuration combat definition. So this is a temporary state, because when we're in sandbox mode, this current combat definition JSON is actually constructed in the sandbox and then passed and saved in this JSON object. Yeah. So it should not be overwritten. And so what happens is we should only load this combat definition when we are not in sandbox mode. This needs to be changed later on to also integrate our current combat situation when we progress through the game, but now we're still not in a phase that we can do that, so this is going to be adjusted in later sessions. And then we do a loop from 1 to 4, and then we do a spawn enemy. And spawn enemy is a different function here that does some initializing of a probability table of enemies, and then we get if the type of the enemy is random, then we get this enemy object type of the advanced random here. Else we get enemy type of the current combat situation. So it could be bird, large spider, small spider, etc. So then it's not random, and then we pick this one. And if it's random, we get one from the probability table, which will adjust later to have more likelihood of werewolves versus birds, etc., etc., depending on some variables. So if it's not none, because if it's none, then eventually we're not going to do anything for that enemy at that number. So this number can be a number of 1 to 4. And then we spawn the enemies. We give the abilities here, the settings of the combat definition. If it's a small spider, we also need a spider cord. We update the HUD, and that's it. So that's what we do here in this prepare battle. So if we're debugging, we also need to create a deck. So debugging means I'll just press play here on the play button here. So then we're in mode debug, and then we create a deck based on this deck definition. So create deck based on deck definition. Deck definitions are here in a JSON file. This is a deck definition. This is a deck definition. So I can really control that when I debug what is in there. And then what we do if it's in a sandbox, if we're in a sandbox environment, we just loop through the equip deck and we create the cards. That's it. And then we do some other stuff for the interface. We fade in, and after the tween of feed in has finished, we call a function called start battle. So at this time, the cards should exist, and then we can set the battle mode. And the mode is actually, if it's set to battle, we're currently battling. It can also be set to discard, for example, and then we're selecting a card to discard. This is other functionality that should be called, and some stuff should be disabled or enabled. So that's done using this battle mode. So we set this battle mode. We show a message saying, okay, the message restart the battle, and then we queue the command next turn, and then we initialize some music. So this is where the magic happens. So message is pretty obvious. It's fight. It's going to say fight. Message start battle is fight. And then it's going to do next turn. And next turn is actually a command function that calls next turn. And then it has a parameter called cards to deal. And this is the number of cards that has to be dealt. This variable here, cards to deal, is a variable that's set using, it's just a standard variable now, it's set to 5 by default, but we're going to add some logic to be able to, for example, add a 6th card depending on X number of variables or whatever. So this is also something that's going to be variable, but it's going to be used as a parameter to this next turn function. And then we do a whole lot of stuff here. We check if there are still enemies alive. And we do a whole lot of stuff that depending on the effects of some cards. And then what we're going to do is determine the strategy. If the turn is not the first turn, that means we're going to have to show a message call saying it's your turn. So this next turn is always called after the enemies have dealt their damage or have done their stuff as well. So the first turn, it's going to say fight, like in start battle. But whenever it's the second or the third or the fourth, whatever turn, this turn is going to be larger than 1, and then it says your turn instead. And then we set a little variable here called num cards to the cards to deal parameter we've been dealt. And then there's some stuff, extra stuff going on that will increase the num cards here, depending on stuff which is applicable right there. And at the end of that, we're going to call draw cards. And draw card is actually what it does. It starts a global variable. It sets the global variable cards to redrawn to the number of cards, and then we call draw card. And actually, draw card is going to be doing this function, and it's going to draw a card. If it sees, okay, there's nothing on the left deck, then we're going to shuffle the cards and put them all on the left deck. And then it's going to create a card tween the card to select the card, the topmost card here at the left deck rather. It's going to pick that card and put the current deck to T, which is stable, and then it tweens it towards 100% opacity. So this rearrange cards function is part of a different video where I show you how to rearrange them into an arc on your hand. And basically how this works is the draw card will draw one card, and whenever the card has been drawn, there's in the cards event sheet here. I'm searching for the cards event sheet. There is a reposition last where we see if there are still cards to be drawn, actually, and if there are still cards to be drawn, what we do is we draw a card again. This will decrease the cards to be drawn again, and this will repeat until this value equals 0. So it's actually, that's the effect you get. Actually, basically, that's the effect you get when the game starts and the cards come one by one onto your hand. That's because they are executed in the Q command one by one after the other. So it's only, the next card is only drawn when all the other cards in your hand are nicely positioned together. So that's the effect you get then. And that's exactly what we want. So that's the next turn, basically. Well, once we end our turn, then there's another function going to be queued, and this function is called end turn. I'm just looking for it here, end turn. Then we check if there are enemies with health higher than 0. Then we do some stuff for like detect from fragile and strong, and then we do some damage for poison. Basically, we check for shields and etc, etc. And at the end of the turn, we call the enemy attack. For all those with still health, we call the enemy attack, and then we call next turn. So for each of those enemies, one by one in sequence, they will attack, basically, and then we will call next turn again. So next turn is basically, again, this one here. Next turn has so many cards to deal. It's the same thing again. What will happen next turn? So the end turn basically also calls next turn, but it does that in a fashion with the Q command, so everything happens right after one another without overlapping, and showing nice things in sequence using that event queue. So that's what happens. If you want to know more on what this queue system is and how it works, there's a separate video on that where I explain more on how the queue system works. But you can check that out as well, of course. As always, please like and subscribe, and if you want the full source code of this project, support me on my Patreon page. The link is in the description.